Good Thursday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for December the 28th. Today we are reading together in Esther chapter 8, which is going to talk about the resolution, well, at least the beginning portion of the resolution to the problem that the Jews are facing. We read yesterday looking at how Haman's plot was uncovered and how Haman himself was we will say, dealt with concerning his treachery that he had tried to commit against Mordecai and all of his family. And yet, at the end of chapter 7, we see, that again, that resolution, they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. And then the text tells us that the king's anger subsided. You might be thinking, okay, yeah, Haman's been dealt with. He's no longer going to be an issue. But there still is the issue of the edict that he had written up and that he had sealed with the king's signet ring. What about that? What's going to happen to the Jewish people still? That's what chapter 8 is going to tell us about here in Esther. Let me get the text up on the screen. We'll read along together here. Esther chapter 8 and verse number 1. That same day, King Ahasuerus awarded Queen Esther the estates of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Mordecai entered the king's presence because Esther had revealed her relationship to Mordecai, and the king removed his signet ring he had recovered from Haman and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put him in charge of Haman's estate. Then Esther addressed the king again. She fell at his feet, wept, and begged him to revoke the evil of Haman the Agagite and his plots he had devised against the Jews. The king extended the gold scepter toward Esther, so she got up and stood before the king. She said, "If it pleases the king, and I have found favor with him, if the matter seems right to the king and I am pleasing in his eyes, let a royal edict be written. Let it revoke the documents the scheming Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, wrote to destroy the Jews who were all in the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see the disaster that would come on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my relatives?" King Ahasuerus said to Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, "Look, I have given Haman's estate to Esther," and he, referring to Haman, he was hanged on the gallows because he attacked the Jews. But write in the king's name whatever pleases you concerning the Jews, and seal it with the royal signet ring. A document written in the king's name and sealed with the royal signet ring cannot be revoked. On the 23rd day of the third month, that is the month Sivan, the royal scribes were summoned. Everything was written exactly as Mordecai commanded for the Jews, to the satraps, the governors, and the officials of the 127 provinces from India to Kush. The edict was written for each province in its own script, for each ethnic group in its own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in King Ahasuerus' name and sealed the edicts with the royal signet ring. He sent the documents by mounted couriers who rode fast horses bred in the royal stables. The king's edict gave the Jews in each and every city the right to assemble and defend themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate every ethnic and provincial army hostile to them, including women and children, and to take their possessions as spoils of war. This would take place on a single day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month Adar. A copy of the text, issued as law throughout each province, was distributed to all the peoples so the Jews could be ready to avenge themselves against their enemies on that day. The couriers rode out in haste on their royal horses at the king's urgent command, and the law was also issued in the fortress of Susa. Mordecai went from the king's presence clothed in royal blue and white, with a great gold crown and a purple robe of fine linen. The city of Susa shouted and rejoiced, and the Jews celebrated with gladness, joy, and honor. In every province, in every city where the king's command and edict reached, gladness and joy took place among the Jews. There was a celebration and a holiday, and many of the ethnic groups of the land professed themselves to be Jews because fear of the Jews had overcome them. And that is the text of Esther chapter 8. Excuse me. All right, so looking here in chapter 8, we're going to see how they're going to resolve now the edict issue. Again, Haman, he's been dealt with. Esther took care of that along with Mordecai at the command of the king. But now we have to figure out, what's going to happen about this edict. The text opens up here in chapter 8, just talking about the reversal that Mordecai continues to have in respect to Haman. Number one, Esther is given the estate of Haman. Basically, everything that belonged to him belongs to her now, although we're going to see in tomorrow's reading as we finish up in Esther chapters 9 and 10 that Haman also has some sons who are going to be dealt with as well. But Esther is given these things. But then Mordecai is able to step into the inner circle of the king whenever Esther reveals to the king the relationship that she has with Mordecai, both being Jews. And again, they're cousins blood-wise, but Mordecai basically raised Esther, adopted her as his own daughter. And the king responds then to Mordecai by removing his signet ring that he recovered from Haman, and he gives it to Mordecai. And then Esther puts him in charge of Haman's estate. So Mordecai, again, continues to switch places with Haman in many ways. We should say the places that Haman was in while he was still alive, thankfully, not switching places with him now, since Haman is dead. But the signet ring that was Haman's is now Mordecai's. The estate, which was Haman's to begin with, is now run by Mordecai. Yes, it is in Esther's care, but Mordecai is the one who is in charge of it. So in many ways, it is his. So again, just these reversals between Mordecai and Haman continue to take place. But then in verse number 3, we do have this issue of the edict, the evil plot that Haman had devised against the Jews. That still has to be dealt with, and because once it's put into law, again, it cannot be revoked, is the language that is used by the Persians in many places, and it's the language that's going to be used here again. So the king does not have the power to just straight up cancel it out. So they've got to figure out some other way to soften it, or to allow the Jews to not be completely destroyed by this previous edict. So that's what Esther approaches the king about. If it pleases the king, if I found favor with him, if the matter seems right to the king, she's really buttering him up. This is up to you. And, if I've been found pleasing in your eyes, which that's Esther's story really, is she's pleasing the eyes of others. Let the royal decree, royal edict be written. Let it revoke the documents the scheming Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagites, wrote to destroy the Jews, whatever it might be. All this, how can I allow this to happen? Please, we've got to do something about this. So King Ahasuerus, in speaking to her, says, look, I've already given you Haman's estate. I even killed him. It's almost like he's saying, I've done a lot for you already. So, why don't you write something in my name concerning the Jews and then seal it with the royal signet ring? And then here's the key. A document written in the king's name and sealed with the royal signet ring cannot be revoked. So that's been stated previously in chapter 1 and verse 19, and also in chapter 3, verse 12. So it's not like he can just cancel it out, but you can write something that could work against it. And in some ways, this is Ahasuerus. This right here isn't a mistake, but this is the kind of decision making where you just go do whatever you want to. I'm basically giving you a blank check for you to go do with it what you will. That's what got him in trouble the first time with Haman. But now he's using it, I guess, in a better way to allow the earlier edict to be dealt with. What's interesting to me is verse number 9, that on the 23rd day of the third month, the month Sivan, the royal scribes were summoned. So we could read this a couple different ways. This can either be 2 months later, Esther summons the scribes, or it could be that they're in the time frame here, maybe in between verses 2 and 3, there was a couple of months that passed. And maybe that's Esther giving it some time to see whether or not these issues were going to resolve themselves. That there was be something maybe that the king himself would say, hey, we need to address this. With that not being the case, it seems maybe Esther stepped forth and really prodded the king into allowing something to be done about this edict. But eventually, the scribes are brought together and they're going to write these things again, just like with Haman's text, right? It's all the provinces and different languages and such, so that everyone can understand. Mordecai is the one who actually ends up writing this letter, writing this edict, and he sends it out with fast horses from the bred from the royal stables. These are horses that are going to encourage, that are going to get to where they need to go. Because again, this message needs to get out fast, because at this point we're what, 9 months away from the day that this edict's supposed to take place. I guess 10 days short of 9 months. So this needs to get out there. And this is really it's not a reversal of Haman's edict, although that's practically what it's going to become. But this is really the counter edict to it. And it says that in the Jews that are in each and every city, they have the right to assemble and defend themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate every ethnic and provincial army hostile to them, including women and children, and to take their possessions as spoils for war. So this all take place, according to King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day, on the 12th month, the month of Adar. So if we're thinking about this, seems pretty harsh, isn't it? Even kill women and children, take all the spoils of war. But as we're going to read tomorrow, that doesn't actually happen. There's no mention of killing women and children. And even says explicitly, I think 3 times, that they did not take spoils from the battles that are going to take place. So this isn't something that Mordecai is saying the Jews must do, but these are, again, exact countermeasures to the initial letter that had been sent out, to the initial edict that had been given out by Haman. So again, this counter edict works to fight against all of the things that were in the first edict. And again, as I mentioned, whenever we read tomorrow in chapter 9, they're not going to kill women and children. They're not going to take spoils of war. We're going to assume there's no women and children killed, because it mentions just men, I believe. And then it does mention specifically the fact that they did not take spoils of war. So in sending this out, then the end result is that this was so the Jews could be ready to avenge themselves against their enemies on the day, and to do so knowing that they have the government's backing in their self-defense. So this is not the Jews standing up against the edict of the king, but that the king is actually with them, again, with the signet ring being his stamp of authority. So the couriers, they rode out with haste at the king's command. The law was also issued throughout the fortress of Susa. And we continue again then to see more role reversals between Mordecai and Haman. That Mordecai was dressed in the royal purple and white, with a gold crown and purple robe of fine linen. So this not only reverses him with Haman, but makes him so much more than Haman ever was. The city of Susa goes from confusion and sadness to now being a place where there was great rejoicing. The Jews go from being in mourning to now celebrating with gladness, joy, and honor. In all the different places, there was joy and rejoicing taking place. There was even a celebration and a holiday among the Jews that we're going to read about in tomorrow's reading. And then notice this. This is very interesting. Remember that the story begins with a Jew who pretended like she wasn't a Jew, who hid her ethnicity, who pretended like she was a Gentile, we could say. But now you have many of the ethnic groups of the land professing themselves to be Jews because fear of the Jews had overtaken them. So now we have Gentiles acting like Jews. And what way were they acting like Jews? We don't really know. We're not really told just how different the Jews look from their Median Persian counterparts within these various provinces and the other ethnic groups. But just as funny, just how much of a swing there is between there initially being the command to be able to kill Jews, and now that there's the opportunity for them to defend themselves, and more than likely over the past couple months they've come to recognize who's gonna want to cause them issues. Then now people are going to want to act like they themselves are Jews so that they might gain the favor of other people. So the edict, at least in theory, has been addressed with this newest edict coming out. The Jews can now defend themselves to the fullest extent and know that the government is behind them in their self-defense. So that's where we're at in the story so far. Tomorrow we're going to read in chapter 9 and chapter 10. I think chapter 10 is just like 3 verses. Yeah, we're going to read chapters 9 and 10 tomorrow to read about this edict being carried out by the Jews, just how they went about it. And then we're going to read about the celebration, the festival of Purim that is going to be established during this time, and that the Jews are going to celebrate moving forward for this great deliverance that they experienced. And of course, so much of this, so much of what we talked about in Esther has been about the fact that God is not explicitly mentioned. He's not mentioned by name, Yahweh, anything like that. And yet certainly we can see how God's favor is with his people and how he provided for them in many ways. We often call that providence, how God's providence provided. That's really redundant, but how his providence provided for his people and allowed them to be spared from the bloodshed that was certainly coming upon them if Haman had had his way. If you have any questions or comments about this text here in Esther chapter 8, please feel free to leave that in the comments section below. I appreciate you taking some time reading along with me today. Hope you have a great rest of your Thursday. We're going to be concluding our reads for 2023 tomorrow, again, as we read together from Esther chapter 9 and Esther chapter 10. Hope to see you then. Take care, and God bless.